Oh, we are group six. We have Rebecca, Larry, Matthew, and Michelle. This year's presidential election has been so long and dramatic. Donald Trump was leading the race in most of the swing states, such as Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania at the beginning. However, Joe Biden started to take the lead a few days later. The main reason for this situation might be that there are more mail-in ballots this year than before.
With the help of mail-in voting and much more awareness being spread to eligible voters, our nation saw historic numbers in this year's election. The 2020 election had the highest voter turnout in US history, along with the most votes counted by mail. Nearly 160 million people voted in this year's election, which is over 20 million more than the election in 2016. And not to mention, we are in the midst of a pandemic. Our turnout rate that is near 70% is very impressive considering that the US ranks horribly at 30th out of 35 nations for voter turnout, according to a study done by Pew Research. Our country did a noteworthy job promoting our right to vote, as well as huge corporations, sports leagues, and celebrities, which ultimately led to our highest voter turnout rate since 1908. We've grown quite a bit as a nation in regards to voting and voting rights, but not everyone had the same privilege to do so not that long ago. Women, Asian Americans, and even Native Americans couldn't vote just over a century ago. And throughout the 20th century, African Americans didn't have the right to vote or had the right to vote, but Jim Crow laws, violence, and intimidation essentially meant that they couldn't vote. Now, in the 2020 election, we were able to spread immensely more voter awareness and availability so that any and every eligible voter can do their civil duty to cast their ballot and vote for the change that they want to see in our nation.
As Matthew mentioned before, this year's election had the highest voter turnout in US history. Moreover, COVID-19 situation caused an extra long time to count the ballots in this year's election. As the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a large number of mail-in ballots in this year's election, each state has different regulations on absentee voting. It is expected that the final result of the vote counting in each state will take a few days longer to count. According to the analysis of agency data by the media, more than 115,000 mailed ballots were not delivered on election day, and more than 12,000 of them were in states that are combat states or swing states, which means the ballots in those states are very close. Although the head of US Postal Service promised that Bureau of officials would check the ballots every day, the Postal Service admitted in a court document that thousands of ballots were not processed in time.
As Lai said, the Postal Service said there was ballots that were not processed on time, and those issues were enough for Donald Trump to oppose it. Before any mishaps like that happened, it's long been known that Trump has been against mail-in voting. He has opposed it again and again, even threatening to sue. Trump wants recounts in the states that he is behind in, Wisconsin being one of them. He cannot accept the results of the 2020 presidential election against Joe Biden. Trump wants to do a recount there as he thinks it will help him. Before the results were even finished being counted, he vowed to challenge the outcome of the results. Milwaukee County was a big liberal county that Trump wanted to target. NBC News stated that Trump paid $3 million for a recount, but it ended up being a 132 vote gain for Biden. This recount did not help Trump at all, as it only helped affirm Joe Biden's victory in the state. Trump used step 5 of Monroe's motivated sequence. Action is what Trump took. He told his supporters the actions he would personally take. He wanted to make sure they were invested in the outcome of the election.
And connecting to Mitchell's points, Trump wanted to recount many of the state's votes due to thinking that they were fraudulent. In particular, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, all key states, he believed were robbed him of his victory. And Trump often believed that mail in voting could be especially vulnerable to fraud during the coronavirus pandemic, as Americans feared going to the polls and instead chose to vote by mail. And then this is from AP News 2020. The US Attorney General Barr had to step in and stop Trump with all of his false claims, as Trump genuinely thought that the election results were being altered out of his favor. And Barr said, in quote, to date, we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election, end quote, which reaffirms the notion that Trump's claims were false. Trump sought a court case to invalidate millions of votes for Biden without any particular evidence. The filings were luckily rejected by all courts for a lack of evidence. In particular, Trump pointed out the states Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, which were all key states for a victory. And the pandemic continues to foreshadow our ways of being, so we have to work through it. And we use these methods like mail in ballots, and it's a secure way to ensure votes to go through. And it may seem particularly odd to switch to this method, but Washington State Director of Elections, Lori Aguino, adds that of nearly 3.2 million ballots cast in Washington in 2018, only 0.004% of the ballots have been fraudulent. So that's an interesting statistic to look at. And in this 2020 election, 84% of Democrats voted through mail in, as opposed to Republicans sending in 74%, according to Politico. And there must be an influence through President Trump as his agenda that voting in person is more legitimate. And to conclude, through all the trials and errors with the pandemic, we were able to figure out a method to register voters and receive mail in ballots. Though it wasn't a favorable method for some, it worked well to gather legitimate votes. It is still disputed by President Trump, and the numbers show that these are authentic votes and it really works. He has paid for recounts and has gone as far as to bring these instances to court, and the tremendous efforts to count and gather votes should be enough to demonstrate the accuracy of votes. And here's our works cited.